Well, early voting gets underway, I want to say next week. And so we join us on the news line is our good friend, Dr. Laura Wilson, my colleague at the University of Indianapolis. She's in the School of Political Science. We teach together on the cage. So, Dr. Laura, my dear, how are you doing? How did you enjoy your spring break or what was left of it?
Well, hey, I'll tell you what, I enjoyed spring break, but I am very excited for this primary. A lot of times our primary elections are not that exciting in Indiana, and for several reasons that I know you and I will get to discuss. This one's going to be different. So, yeah, really looking forward to it.
Well, let's start with this. How would you describe the political climate these days in Indiana?
Yeah, I think people are very engaged, and certainly watching it. It's a double-edged sword. I think there is obviously a lot of anger. There's a lot of consternation. On one hand, the folks that support the policies you see are really excited and they're enthusiastic, right? They want to see more of the same. But just in general, and this would be Indiana, this would be nationwide, we have seen an increase in political violence, an increase in threats and intimidation, just in general, like caustic language to the point that I look at political news. Obviously, this is what we do, right? All the time. And there'll be items and pieces that I'm like, "Ah, I just don't want my kids to see, right? Like, I don't think children should be exposed to this in a way that is really upsetting, not just obviously as a parent, but as a political scientist and an analyst. Where you think just in general, there's been so much tension, right? So much conflict, so much controversy, and so many really disagreements that go beyond what we can respectfully say, I just disagree with you, right? There's that. And it's not just, of course, in Indiana, it's nationally. But I think that is the real concern that whether you love or hate what's going on, right? That kind of tension. And I know you and I have talked for years about polarization. It certainly contributes to this, and vice versa, is an outcome because of this kind of language, this rhetoric, and of course the actions that unfold from it. That's the part that I think is most concerning. And we definitely see that right now in 2026 in Indiana and throughout the country.
And the other part too, Dr. Laura, that just sort of surprises me is just sort of the say now obviously we always sort of romanticize about the old days, but the old days weren't all that great. I mean, people actually used to get caned on the House and Senate floor. But before we could disagree without being disagreeable. Now, if you have disagreement with someone, political wise, it's taken as a personal affront.
And it's crazy to me when you consider the fact that that's more or less what politics is, right? Like politics is the resolution of conflict. And I realize resolution is the first word in that definition, but conflict is pretty important. You're naturally going to have disagreements. To your point, you're right. Like, there was times people hit each other over the heads with canes on the U.S. Senate floor. And so there is an improvement in that regard. But I also think when you consider social media, right? The 24/7 news cycle, what feels like echo chambers within news and how we get our information and who we look for information for all of those things in ways it's actually gotten worse with regards to some of that. And I think the biggest challenge when we're talking about like this kind of political rhetoric, this kind of division, to your point, is not just to agree to disagree. And I recognize these are some of these are very hot button issues. Some of these are life and death issues. I'm not saying you shouldn't care, you shouldn't be passionate. Right? I think the argument that you and I and many others would make is that you really have to be able to say, I understand where you're coming from. I may not agree with it, but to not dehumanize a person, to not make it personal in an attack, but to separate it, to keep it political, it's very hard to do. And I think, unfortunately, increasingly we see people failing to do that. And I should add this, I think it's important, not just bystanders, not just audience members, viewers, listeners, right? Readers, not just constituents and voters, but actual elected officials, public officials who serve, hopefully, in the public's best interest. Right? When they devolve to that, and I recognize that we hold them to a higher standard. I think everybody should be respectful in their politics. They should practice political civility. But when our elected leaders can't do that, I think in so many ways it opens the doors and it almost lowers the expectations for other people, right? Normal viewers, voters, whatever it is, looking, watching, paying attention. And they say, well, hey, if my elected leader doesn't have to do that, neither do I.
Our guest on the program today is our good friend, Dr. Laura Wilson, fellow colleague at the University of Indianapolis. She's in the School of Political Science. We're talking about the upcoming elections, the upcoming primaries. Early voting gets started next month. Dr. Laura, something I thought was interesting too, and this kind of goes to that political violence issue. Normally, I mean, you can see things happening in maybe some parts of the country, but not here in Indiana. And I go specifically to my good friend Greg Good, who was doxxed not too long ago over the whole redistricting fight, and then people getting threats and intimidation on sort of both sides of this issue. What the heck is going on?
Man, I mean, obviously tensions are high. People have very strong opinions. But I think what we see is going simply beyond that, where people would disagree verbally. But when you're talking about doxing and then the threats of violence and physical intimidation, and this is beyond redistricting, but we had that judge up in Tippecanoe County, I believe in January, who was shot along with his wife. And you're talking about like actual political violence, right? That is a next step. That is obviously going beyond what we'd seen before. But if we're being really honest with ourselves, if we're really being reflective, we have to recognize that not just actions have consequences, but what we say has consequences. And we've seen an escalation in rhetoric for quite some time now. And it doesn't just stop there. Just saying things isn't the end all be all. When you escalate the rhetoric and what you're saying, right? The tone, the dialogue, the language you're using, the actual terminology itself. And then you say, well, what's the next step? Of course, people are going to be up in arms, like in a literal sense, like people will be angry. And so looking at this, going back to the senators who were doxxed, especially during the redistricting conversation, late fall, early winter in the December session here in Indiana, it was next level of people have always disagreed over politics, and they always will. Go back to my definition of resolution of conflict. That is normal. It's natural. It's uncomfortable for some people. That's just how it is, right? What we see here is going beyond that. And what I would hope and what I would, my ideal is that is a one-off, that is unique to that circumstance. It was horrible, and do not get me wrong, but that stops there. Right. But we all have to agree, like as a society, as a community, we all have to agree that's unacceptable. Right. So the people that do behave in that way are seen as fringe. And we did see our state legislature address the question of doxing. Right. We saw many people speak out against it, including our governor, who did support redistricting, but said, doxing is not OK. That is not acceptable or appropriate. But we need to make that voice, right, that the majority say this is unacceptable. That has to be loud and clear so people don't resort. They don't think that that's an okay behavior. And maybe this just becomes a blip where we say, oh, yeah, you remember in 2025 when there was that big redistricting conversation and legislators' lives were threatened? Oh, I'm glad we've evolved from that. I'm glad it didn't go any further, right? As horrible as it was. That's what I hope we can look back and say.
Our guest on the program today is my good friend, Dr. Laura Wilson, my colleague at the University of Indianapolis. We teach in the School of Political Science on occasion. She teaches a lot more than I do these days. So we're always good and happy to have her on the program. Dr. Laura, let's go from the national political climate to Indiana. Well, actually, no, I take that back. One last thing on the national political climate. We've had special elections so far, and Democrats have actually done very, very well in those special elections. I think they won almost all of them, or switched either won all the seats or switched from Republican to Democrat. I'm looking at the situation in Texas recently. I was like, wow, that's when Texas starts to go blue, you know there's something going on here. Now, are these just sort of special? All races are local and unique, or are we seeing canaries in the coal mine?
Can it be both? Is that an option? I choose option C if this is a multiple choice question, right? So on one hand, let me start with the all politics is local. I think we have seen enough exceptions to that old adage where I want to amend it to say much of politics is still local, but it depends on the race. It depends on the circumstances of the election cycle. There are a lot of caveats where we used to say this, just as background for our audience, for listeners here, right? We would say politics is local because so many people would vote for a candidate because they knew them, right? Especially when you're talking about low information elections. So think about your state legislative elections. Think about any of your city council races, school board races, right? Other things didn't matter. You knew the person. You knew of them. They did a lot for the district. They had a lot of constituency services. So that politics is local. On a national level, we might say, oh, I don't know, this candidate doesn't seem to be fitting, jiving with the district. There'd be different things that analysts outside of the area, like myself, would say these things don't make sense. But it was that local element of politics that was so important. I do think there is still some of that, but I said I think much of politics is local, not all of it. Right? We've seen a nationalized media, a focus more on national issues. And I think the real interesting thing this cycle, it's a congressional midterm, so it is a national election cycle. You mentioned Texas, which has been fascinating to watch. I'd also point out North Carolina. They both had their primaries a couple weeks ago. People point back to this past fall in 2025 and look at California Prop 50, which was in favor of allowing the state to redistrict. And that was as a Democratic push, unlike in Indiana, it would have been a Republican push, right? You saw New Jersey and Virginia elect Democratic governors, but those are off-year elections. This is a national federal election cycle. So I think there are, when you talk about canaries in the coal mine, I do think that we're seeing some Democratic resistance, right? And they're probably higher than average Democratic Party turnout that's probably engaged and enraged with what's going on the national level. I do want to add, and I know you and I know this very well, and probably our listeners are very engaged. I'm sure they do too. But I think it's important to remember this is somewhat typical and predictable because when you're talking about a congressional midterm, even though the president isn't on the ballot,
he is on the ballot.
Yes, he is, right? Like it's the referendum on the president without actually voting for him. And that's so important. And that's how voters are going to react. Like, and very much in so many ways, this is, do you like what the president's doing? Check yes or no kind of thing. And the party in power and the president's party tend to fare very poorly in congressional midterms. That's why Donald Trump wanted to advocate for redistricting in a non-redistricting year, not a part of the cycle, right? So that I think is really important to remember too. Like by all measures, if all other things were equal, we would expect the Democrats to do better this cycle because the Republicans have unified government. They control the House, the Senate, and the White House at the federal level. And this is typically that pendulum swimming back after 2 years saying, what? They didn't contribute, didn't do everything they said they would do. They haven't finished everything, and then flipping for the other party.
And I also want to say too, Dr. Laura, going back to the 1980s-ish, as we carbonate ourselves here, in that 6 year of a presidential term, president gets elected, one term, and that 6 year is kind of like a sitcom that sort of jumped the shark. In a sense, because if you go back to 2006, we saw this, and I saw this in 1986. I want to say the only maybe acceptance rule was 1998 when Bill Clinton was in the 6 year of his term. Democrats actually gained seats, but that was also at the impeachment stuff going on as well.
Yeah, and it is unusual, right? Like to your point, I always think in 2010, and this would have been in President Obama's first term. And President Trump is unique in that because he has two non-contiguous terms. Not the only person, obviously, Cleveland did too, but in the modern presidency, that makes it pretty unique. But in 2010, after a big wave of Democrat success in 2008 that brought forward Barack Obama as the presidential candidate, right? The presumptive nominee. You saw in 2010, especially the Tea Party and conservative movement, a huge success for Republicans in that election cycle. So that's essentially what we're tracking and looking for. I think the measure is always going to be how much, right? Back in 2022, we were expecting a red wave, and it was more of like a red splash, if you will, for conservatives. They were still successful, but maybe not to the margins and the same amount we thought they would be. So really, that's probably a better question to ask. It's not that will Democrats be successful? They, by all standards, likely will be given the circumstances of the election, but how much, right? How successful in what races? You mentioned Texas, right? That is not necessarily a friendly land for Democratic candidates. But if voters are showing up there, what does that tell us about the other states? And I think it's really the margin for Democrats that's going to be really interesting to watch here.
Dr. Laura Wilson, the University of Indianapolis School of Political Science on the program today. We're talking about sort of the national political landscape, and also with early voting get underway within a few days. We're looking at sort of Indiana. Dr. Laura, let's turn our attention to Indiana if we could. One thing I thought was interesting was the fact that so many state senators have primary challenges. Yeah. And not only do they have primary challenges, these primary challenges are being funded and encouraged by folks like Mike Braun, folks like Jim Banks, folks like Turning Point USA, and to a lesser degree, even Diego Morales.
Mm-hmm. And these are really interesting. Because first of all, I think that is what makes an exciting primary election. To what I said at the opening, like hey, a lot of times we think the primaries are pretty perfunctory. You might have one race on your ballot where it's not even just having a challenger to try to unseat the incumbent, but a quality challenger, right? Somewhere where it's like there's a lot of money being spent in this race. This is someone who really might be influential, and this is where I think the president has put his money where his mouth is, so to speak. President Trump had said for those specifically Senate Republicans who opposed redistricting back in December, he was going to, support challengers. And I don't know financially when I say where his mouth is, but I do know, obviously, the endorsements have been really important. And we've seen President Trump endorse in a variety of state Senate races, right? Like there were 6 really big endorsements for those challengers seeking to unseat incumbent senators that had voted against redistricting. He's also endorsed, I believe, 9 Republican candidates that either are running unopposed. So, the endorsement doesn't matter that much, but it's still nice to have, I'm sure, for those candidates. Or they have challengers that are probably not seen as likely favorites there. So having this kind of competition in the primary, it does speak to certainly redistricting in that particular issue. I think it's always great for voters to have competition in general. It is important, though, that we remember incumbency advantage is big. And so the bigger question certainly will be is how many voters turn out in the primaries and how do they view redistricting, right? That's likely the primary reason you have these challengers in the first place. So from the voters' perspective, do they support their incumbent legislator and what they did back in December? Do they disagree? They want someone new voice, new face. And then they're going to support the challenger there. It is, I think, the most exciting primary election cycle just across the board when you're looking at so many different races that have at least competition on the ballot, let alone maybe quality competition. I think it's the most exciting primary election we've seen in a long time.
Dr. Laura Wilson on the program today, School of Political Science at the University of Indianapolis. We teach together on occasion. So we're talking about the lay of the landscape, particularly with the primary, early voting in the primary just getting underway in about a week or so and some change. Dr. Laura, something else I thought was interesting too with these primary challenges is it's one thing, obviously money matters, but also argue relationships matter. And if you're a Greg Good down over in Terre Haute or Travis Holdman, up in northeastern Indiana, or Ron Alting in the Lafayette area. Mm-hmm. If you're not going to town halls, not doing all the stuff you're supposed to be doing, talking to your elected officials, talking to voters, hearing their concerns, you're going to be in trouble. But if you are, you should be in relatively good shape because money doesn't necessarily win elections.
Not always. It doesn't. No, it plays a large role, but it is not the end all be all. That goes back to the all, or what I'm going to say from now on, right? Most politics is local, right? Do constituents feel like you're serving them, you're representing them, you're listening to them, you care about them? That is the essence of democracy in and of itself. From a voter's perspective, you're looking at the candidate you think best represents you. And there is good research to suggest that those interactions with voters, even voters who might be reticent to support you, maybe don't agree with you on every issue. And I'm not saying, complete opposite. Someone who's super liberal is not just going to have an interaction with a candidate very conservative and all of a sudden flip their vote. But those interactions matter, those relationships matter. And that is one of the benefits that incumbents tend to have because they're able to provide constituency services. They have resources of office. Right? They already are in that position and they're more likely to be invited to things anyway, because it's not just, Mr. or Ms. So-and-so who wants to be your state senator. It is your state senator, your elected voice in the Indiana General Assembly in the Senate chamber. And people are more likely to favor that incumbent, even just in terms of invitations for events. But I do think, to your point, those kind of relationships matter. And these are what we call traditionally low information elections, as I mentioned earlier. So while money and advertising can help, if you know the person, if you recognize your incumbent's name, if you generally like, or you don't have strong opinions otherwise about the candidates, all of those things are going to work in favor of the incumbent too. But I wouldn't predict, I don't prognosticate like that. Not a fortune teller, just a political scientist here. But While I don't know which races will flip, I think you have enough challengers. It's going to be fascinating to see on the evening of May 5th or maybe the morning of May 6th, right? After a primary election, right? Some of these challengers very well may be successful. And then we can do a post-mortem after the fact to figure out, what were the traits, what were the differences that led to some of those successes. And of course, likely some of them, the incumbents will win re-election in that primary election. And we can analyze that too.
And something else I thought was interesting as well, particularly with the primary challengers. If you're going to go against your state senator because he voted against redistricting, but that's for a lot of these lawmakers, that's what their constituents wanted. They said, "Hey, why are you doing this now? Why change the rules in midstream? I know you can, but should you? Blah 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 blah." But if you're running against a senator and you're saying, "Hey, I'm running against him because he did what you wanted him to do," that to me doesn't make sense. Or is that just welcome to 2026?
Yeah, well, I don't think they will actually say that, though your point is valid. What I think those challengers frame it as is certainly if they have Trump's endorsement, Donald Trump has won 3 years, I mean, 3 election cycles. Every time he's been on the ballot in Indiana, he's won by large margins. So that name matters, that endorsement matters, that support matters. But I think with the way that a challenger is going to effectively phrase this is to say, look, the president wanted this, and he's done right by our community, and our legislator is out of touch. The tricky thing whenever you rely on what a majority of my constituents say is you are always relying on a sample of people who reach out to you. Or if you had the town halls, right? People that attended the town halls, it's going to be skewed. It's going to be biased. It is not, I'm not arguing here, right? It's not to say that the districts didn't disagree with redistricting, but what I imagine the challenger can adequately argue is no, there were a lot of us here that thought this was important because the president wanted it and we wanted to see Republicans maintain their positions in Congress. And you almost have a finger pointing. It's like hearsay, like no one can prove this, right? But no, a lot of constituents wanted what our legislator voted against. And so you should want to have a new representation, a new voice and face in the state house. Numerically, because these are small districts, we don't have a lot of robust survey data to counter that with facts. But these will be the campaign arguments. And I think at the end of the day, voters are going to assess both their incumbent legislator for these races that we're discussing, right? Like, what have they done? Well, how have they served you? How do they represent your community? Right. And then they look at the challenger. Do you think this would be a better alternative? And that, at the end of the day, is going to be the decision that voters will have to make in those primaries.
Our good friend Dr. Laura Wilson with us on the program for a few more minutes as we get caught up on the upcoming political landscape here in Indiana, also the primary early voting getting underway in just a few days. Dr. Laura, obviously the Senate is where a lot of our attention is, but also I want to say too, the fact that we have some statewide challenges as well. Diego Morales has challenges, particularly the Secretary of State's race on the Republican side. You got Diego Morales, the incumbent, going against Dave Shelton. You've got Blythe Potter versus Bo Bai, and also my good friend and former administrator, he used to be on the faculty at UIndy, Greg Ballard, as an independent.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is a really exciting race. As you mentioned, having not just like having an independent candidate, but someone as strong and as well known, certainly in Marion County, right? But it is the largest county in Indiana, and no doubt campaigning in the other 91 in the state. Like, you have Greg Ballard, which really changes the game in that race. And that was already an exciting race. So we talked about Diego Morales as the Republican incumbent has natural advantages, but he has a lot of self-imposed liabilities. There's many people within the party that are doubting his status, his position there. And we've seen that before. If you think back to like Attorney General Curtis Hill, even Eric Holcomb, right, initially popular as governor, that popularity started to wane, especially outside of the center of the state and donut counties. There are times when within the party you see like the fracture really stress itself, and the differences that parties seem to represent people that all agree on the same general items, but there's a lot of difference and divergence. And I think you definitely see that in terms of Secretary of State. That's why you have a longtime Republican in Greg Ballard running as an independent, right? He has that background with the party, not running on the party label. And then, of course, you mentioned there's Blythe Potter for the Democrats, Bo Bai. Those will be determined in the convention. But Bai has tremendous name recognition through his his lineage with his father and his grandfather, and feels like a very strong Democratic candidate. I know Blythe Potter, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, has strong supporters as well and offers a unique candidacy. The fact that there are many interesting candidates in this race makes it pretty exciting. And Secretary of State is basically top of ticket for us. We will have all of your 9 congressional seats for Indiana, but we don't have a U.S. Senate race. We already talked about this is a congressional midterm, so there is no presidential race. And we're one of a handful of states that elects our governor at the same time as the president. So Secretary of State naturally would be an important race this cycle anyway, but because of the candidates that we have, not just high quality, but variety, I think you see this. This is probably the race, certainly statewide race, obviously, but the race to watch on it when we're looking at that primary and the general election come November.
And speaking of November, as we get ready to wind up our conversation here, something I want to get your thoughts on as well. Uh, Indiana Democrats, for the first time in a really long time, at least for the first time since I've been here in Indiana since 2004, basically have state house candidates and Senate candidates in almost every district here in Indiana. Now, obviously, some districts are more Republican than others, more Democrat than others. But at the end of the day, it drives up the vote totals because, once again, I would tell people it's competition that drives turnout, not necessarily voting hours or when you can vote or whatever. But if Democrats have enough people in enough contested races, could that sort of change the dynamics at the top of the ticket and maybe help a vote-by candidate in places where Democrats don't normally necessarily do well?
Yeah, it absolutely can. And I think one other dynamic here that's really interesting to see is just having so many candidates. The fact that you will certainly have a Democrat and a Republican, but also a strong independent candidate. So there's a third party candidate. We are not a runoff state. You do not have to have a majority in the general election in order to win. You simply have to have plurality. And I think when you're talking about these different dynamics with the candidacies themselves, right, it makes it both a interesting race to watch, but far from the traditional, predictable statewide executive office races that we've expected in Indiana, right? That's what we've seen. That's what we've gotten used to, complacent with even in the last 10 years. So this one in particular makes it really exciting to view.
All right. Well, our guest on the program today has been our good friend, Dr. Laura Wilson at the University of Indianapolis, School of Political Science. Love her to death. Always a pleasure to talk to you about good friend, Dr. Laura, and we will talk again real soon.
Always my pleasure, too. Thank you so much, Abdul.
All right. Let me stop this here.
Perfection.
I think we got it.
Awesome.